Right, so hello everybody. I will start now. So I have the pleasure to introduce you our distinguished guest, Gilly Carr from the University of Cambridge. Dr. Carr is an associate professor in archaeology, and she's one of the best experts in archaeology of modernity.
I think you have that title covered.
Archaeology and archaeology's Holocaust archaeology. So thank you very much for coming to present, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Pavel, for inviting me to be at the University of West Bohemia to come and speak to your students and colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here, everybody. You're very kind for listening to me speaking in a foreign language. I do apologize for making you all listen to someone speaking in English for an hour. I know that's quite taxing, but thank you for that courtesy. I'm afraid I don't speak Czech. Anyway, I'm going to be talking to you about a research project that I'm working on at the moment. And as you can see, the title of my talk today is called The Case for a Pragmatic Response to Holocaust Heritage in the 21st Century. And I'm going to start off by talking to you about the project I'm working on. Now, I'm a member of the United Kingdom's delegation to the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, also known as IRA as an acronym. How many of you have heard of IRA, or the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance? Anybody? Well, I'm introducing you to it today. IRA is an international organization that brings together experts and politicians and ambassadors to work and advance on the subject of Holocaust research, Holocaust memory, Holocaust education, and commemoration. And I think I'm probably the only archaeologist who is represented at IRA. And so this is why I wanted to chair a project that IRA was setting up to find a way to safeguard Holocaust, somebody needs a cuddle, to safeguard Holocaust sites in Europe. So when I talk about Holocaust sites, what kind of sites am I talking about? What kind of sites are covered by the Charter? Because this project is about writing a European charter, and I mean European in a geographical sense rather than in a purely political sense, a charter to safeguard all sorts of Holocaust heritage in Europe today. So the kind of sites that we're including within this title are concentration camps, extermination camps, forced labor camps, transit camps, killing sites, mass graves, ghettos, prisons, places of detention, death march routes, etc. And so just to explain to you what these photographs are here, Pavel, you will recognize this one. This one was taken in Kastitsa. Is it Kastitsa or Kastitsa? Kastitsa. In the Czech Republic. This is the site of a mass grave. This is, I took this photograph at Sachsenhausen. This is the start of a death march route, which is marked by memorial stones. This is Compiègne. Compiègne is a transit camp just outside of Paris, where French Jews were brought together before being sent to Auschwitz. It's a site that was like Drancy, which is a better known site that you might know from France. And this is Zürchen forced labor re-education camp in Germany. So that's just a little example of the kind of sites that we're thinking about. Why do we need to safeguard these sites? Why do we need to look after them today? What's the problem? We know that there were around 44,000 of these kinds of sites in Europe during the Second World War. But we don't know what sort of state they're in today. Nobody's ever counted, nobody's ever looked. And I was recently in Poland, and in one of the war museums there, I saw this quote that I really liked. We're not responsible for the past, meaning we in this room, we younger generation who didn't live through the war, we're not responsible for the past, but we are responsible for the memory of the past. It's for us to do what we can to safeguard that memory and make sure that things aren't forgotten. As the last survivors from the war pass away, our attention goes to the sites, because the sites become the site of information, and they're witnesses to the past. There's a lot, as archaeologists, that we can still find at these sites. They're crime scenes, they're witnesses to genocide and crimes against humanity. But also they're important because they're places of memorialization and commemoration and education across Europe. How many of you have visited a Holocaust site or a concentration camp? And tell me, which sites have you been to? Just call out names. Terezin or Auschwitz? Flossenberg's quite close. Okay. And I think all of us go to these places because we recognize they're still important. They're important for all of these reasons. But they're also reminders of the depths to which humanity can sink. They act as a warning as well for us. This is a picture of the site of Stylo Simic in Belgrade in Serbia. And I might say a few words about this later on. Now, as part of writing this European Charter to safeguard sites, the first thing we have to do is identify what are the threats, what are the challenges, what are the risks, what are the problems that these sites are facing today. And as part of this project, we've identified 16 key problems. And I hope I've got the slides coming up to illustrate these, but they include climate change, lack of financial support, threats to the site integrity, such as looting, distortion and misappropriation, and I'll explain that later, lack of heritage protection legislation. If the sites aren't protected, then they can just be bulldozed, problems of private ownership, destruction due to new building projects, neglect and decay, deliberate destruction, for example, terrorism, vandalism, also destruction in armed conflict. We know of sites that are being destroyed in Ukraine at the moment. Encroachment of new buildings which are too close to the site. I'll show you some images of that. Inappropriate reuse of site. I'm sure Pavel's spoken to you all about Lety. That was a pig farm. I'm sure you know that case study very well. Lack of acknowledgement or identification or interpretation at a site. So there's no sign saying what was there. Wear and tear caused by too many visitors. Lack of a management plan, and lack of heritage interpretation for linked sites. I'll explain all of these in the slides coming up. So these are the key problems. Let's have a look. What does that look like? First of all, climate change. I think this is going to be a bigger problem than any of us have realized until now. This is a photograph of Gusen, the crematorium in Gusen. Gusen was a subcamp of Mauthausen in Austria, and you can see the floodwaters are pretty high in this image. This is from Jasenovac in Croatia. There are mass graves over here that were also flooded, but I think flooding is a particular problem. Destruction and vandalism. Well, here's a picture from Auschwitz-Birkenau in Poland, and actually there's a lot of graffiti at Auschwitz. I think it would probably be quite hard for an archaeologist who is interested in prisoner graffiti to unpick all of these layers of graffiti by visitors. And this is a photograph of the burnt barrack block at Sachsenhausen. An arsonist set fire to it a number of years ago, and they've kept it preserved with the destruction caused by the arsonist as a way of showing the attack by neo-Nazis. Destruction in armed conflict. Well, this is a picture from Twitter put out by the Babin Yar Holocaust Memorial Center showing the destruction at Drobytsky Yar in Ukraine. That's okay. Of course, archaeologists haven't been able to get out here yet to assess what the damage is. And we know there's been destruction to a lot of cultural sites, a lot of heritage sites in Ukraine, a lot of museums. And in terms of the actual damage to the archaeological record, we're unsure at this stage. Neglect and decay. Well, here's... sorry, Pavel, we already had this conversation. It's in Germany, not the Czech Republic. My mistake. I was on a big trip where we travelled from Germany to the Czech Republic, and I forgot what side of the border Zirchenkamp is. This is Stylo Simic in Serbia. It started to be restored in 2022, and this photograph was taken 10 years ago before any kind of restoration. And inappropriate reuse of sites. I'm sure Pavel has shown you this image many times. Are you all familiar with this one? It's at the pig farm in Leti, but also this example at a subcamp of Buchenwald in Germany. Somebody wanted to put up a sausage museum, of all things, at the subcamp of a Holocaust site. I mean, can you think of anything? Well, you can think of something more inappropriate, but I mean, you know, knowing that that Jews don't eat pork because it's not kosher. I mean, you know. Then you have the problem of distortion and denial and misappropriation or silences. Now, let me give you an example of that. Last year, as part of this project, we went to Kaunas in Lithuania. And the city of Kaunas is known as a place of a huge number of massacres. Now, the city of Kaunas is ringed by 19th century forts. And at each one of the forts, they massacred different groups of people. And there's an information plaque here at the fourth fort, which says, during World War II, the fourth fort was used as a place of massacre of peaceful citizens. Why aren't they telling us who? Well, it's a place of massacre of Jews. But in Lithuania, the people who did the massacring were the Nazis, but also they were joined by Lithuanian collaborators. And what makes it very difficult for Lithuanians to admit that their own people massacred Jews is that just before, a few months before the massacring of the Jews, the Lithuanian soldiers had been involved in fighting the Soviets, fighting the Russians and getting them out of the country. And so in one moment, these men are heroes, and then a few months later, they're involved in massacring Jews. And it was very difficult for Lithuanian people to sort of talk about people being both heroes and villains. And for a long time, there was just this silence. And you will often see in certain countries, in museums across Europe, where things are hard to talk about, people simply won't talk about them. And so in the museum in Kaunas, in the Holocaust Museum, they only talk about the Nazis who did the massacring. And it's very important to identify where these silences are, but also identify where narratives become distorted by governments. Now, just before I came to the Czech Republic, I was in Serbia for a week. And I was invited as the guest of the Genocide Victims Museum of Belgrade. And I was invited to give recommendations at a mass grave. And the problem in Serbia, the former Yugoslavia is a very... Are there any people in the room from the former Yugoslavia? I have to ask before I say anything. No? Okay, I'm safe, okay. Because there have been there's so much hatred still in the country, so much inter-ethnic hatred and tension that you have to be very careful what you say because people still hate each other. And if you're invited to one country, it then becomes hard to then go to another country in the former Yugoslavia because you're seen to be on somebody's side and therefore not on somebody else's side. And in Serbia, although they talk about the Holocaust, they also talk about Serbian genocide. And Serbian genocide for them is more important than talking about the Holocaust. And it's to emphasize how in the Second World War, the Serbs were the victims, whereas in the war, the more recent war in the former Yugoslavia, Serbs were the perpetrators. But they want the focus on being the victims. That's sort of putting it very simply. And so it can be very hard. A lot of their narratives, the stories they tell at sites, are very distorted to suit the political government, to suit the government. And so working there is very difficult. But anyway, I just wanted to make you aware that governments can tell the story of the past incorrectly in order to benefit themselves and the story they tell about the past. Let's move on to thinking about threats to site integrity. Now this is interesting. I'm going to talk to you about the example of Mauthausen concentration camp in Austria. And in recent years, this lift was put at the site. The people who go to Mauthausen today, they're tourists, they're visitors like us, they're academics, but there's also survivors and the children of survivors. And even now, the children of survivors are getting old. And this means that climbing up the steps to go from here to up there can be difficult. And so the director gave permission for a lift to be installed at Mauthausen. And she got a lot of criticism because this was seen as intervening in the historic fabric of the site. This is clearly not an original part of the concentration camp. And so it's controversial to disturb the original fabric. But at the same time, you might be familiar with, in Mauthausen, the site is associated with a quarry, the same as at Flossenburg. There's a quarry, and then you go up the stairs, and there's the camp. And you might have seen the old black and white historical photograph of prisoners carrying big blocks of stone on their backs, which weighed more than they did. I don't know how they managed to carry them. And therefore, pilgrims, visitors, like to climb up these steps in the footprints of the prisoners, in the steps of the prisoners. It's part of the experience of going to Mauthausen. This is what people like to do. But according to Austrian law, the director of Mauthausen Memorial is personally responsible if anybody falls down the stairs and breaks a leg. They can sue her. And so the only thing that she's been able to do is to put up a barrier to stop people going up and down the stairs. Similarly, she has been handed a list of 400 changes that she has to make to the historical fabric of Mauthausen to make it accessible. So she has been instructed to remove original stairs from the site and to replace it with wheelchair ramps. Now, on the one hand, we can say this makes the site more accessible for older people, for people with disabilities. That's a good thing. But on the other hand, this involves destroying the original fabric of the site. And this is a problem. This is a problem. How do we balance these two things? Because we can see the benefits of this, but also we can see the problems. And with each of these threats that I'm talking about, there isn't an easy solution. All of these things demand a whole conversation, a big conversation about what to do. Let me give you another example of threats to site integrity. This is an example from Auschwitz-Birkenau. And some British schoolboys, in fact from my city, from Cambridge, went on a school trip to Auschwitz. And I don't know, well, I'm sure all of you, if you have been, as your archaeologists, I'm sure your eyes were on the floor looking. And indeed, there are places in Auschwitz where you can go and you can see buttons, you can see bits of things. You can see artifacts. They're fragmented, but you can see them. And these schoolboys took home some window glass, some buttons, and this is part of hair clippers. But in Auschwitz, you can face a 10-year prison sentence for removing objects from the site. This is classed as looting. And the schoolboys, despite being teenage schoolboys, were put on trial in Poland. Now, they were not put in prison because they were too young. But at the same time, this hit the national, probably the international headlines. I imagine it was reported in Poland as well as in England. And really, this makes us aware that I think one of the first things we learn as archaeologists is that when we visit sites, if we find things, we don't take them away. If we're excavating, we don't take the objects and put them in our pockets to take home. We understand the importance of the materiality, of the material culture for teaching us about the past. And so what these boys are doing is taking away from the story that we as archaeologists can tell. Now, the next problem I want to flag up is private ownership, because many of these sites are privately owned, but that tends to apply to sites that are not national memorials. So to give you some examples here, this is an example from Alderney in the Channel Islands. So this is a group of 5 islands between France and Britain that have been British for about 1,000 years. And this house here is built on top of a labour camp. And you can see the original entrance posts of the labour camp here. Now, I don't know who would want to live on a site like this, but nonetheless, the island of Alderney is 3 miles by 1.5 miles. It's very small. Everybody really has a camp in their back garden because there were 2 concentration camps, 2 labour camps, and many more temporary camps in the island. This example here is from a site of Gunskirchen in Austria. And this was a sub-camp of Mauthausen. It's in the middle of a forest. And you can see the traces of that camp. I hope to have some more slides of it coming up. But this particular part of the forest is owned by a number of landowners, and there's a fence through the middle of the camp, sort of arbitrarily dividing up camp space. And so archaeologists who want to excavate there need the permission of several people. This image was taken in the sub-camp of Gusen, near Mauthausen in Austria, and this is part of the camp. Now, I should say that in Gusen, at the end of the war, they knocked down the camp, but they kept just a few original buildings, and they built a town, a new town, on top of where the concentration camp was. But of those historic buildings, people still live there today, and there are high fences to stop the tourists having a look. So this private ownership, it prevents scholars like us from going and learning. It prevents tourists from going. It can prevent archaeological work. It can prevent commemoration. The next problem I want to tell you about is lack of acknowledgement or identification or interpretation at the site. And so this is another photograph from Alderney in the Channel Islands, and this is a local historian, and he is showing the location of a cemetery, and there's probably some mass graves in this area as well. The archaeological evidence indicates that there are mass graves here. But there's absolutely no indication on the ground of where it was. There's no marker, there's no memorial, there's no nothing. And so here's me. And so you can visit the site and look around, and when you're on the ground, you just can't see anything at all. There's no mound, there's no obvious change of vegetation. You can see it more clearly on Google Earth, but when you're on the ground, it's impossible to see where the mass grave was. And so when we're thinking about safeguarding these sites and looking after them and doing the best thing for them, at the very minimum, you need to have a sign saying, there's a mass grave here. Now, what do you think, if you visit the site of a mass grave, do you feel that you have to change your behaviour? Do you think it's fine to walk your dog, for example, over the area of a mass grave? This is what local people do. There's no signs. It's a small island. People walk their dogs here. Do you think that's okay? Should there be signs saying, you know, that so if people visit the site, they have to walk like this? I mean, this is a question. In every country in Europe, there are perhaps different ideas about how you behave at the site of a dead. You know, obviously, you don't have to go home and put on black clothes before walking in the area. Obviously, nobody says you can't laugh or smile in this area. But there are ways one might modify your behaviour if it's a site of a massacre, of a death, of killing, etc. Oh, and I should also say one of the problems, at least in Alderney, is the problem of hostile local communities, because this small island, 2,000 people live there, and it's not easy when you're living on top of or next to a concentration camp. For people in Alderney, their island is beautiful. It's about the golden beaches, the pretty flowers, the wildlife, the relaxed pace of living by the seaside. The way they think about themselves, their identity is not as people living on top of a concentration camp. And so they don't want to talk about it, they don't want to think about it. They know it's there, but they are quite hostile to outsiders coming along and saying to them, how about having an information board? Because you know that if you put up an information board, local people would take it down. They would vandalise it. They don't want to be reminded of this. And that's a problem. So let's think about that inappropriate behaviour. While we were in Lithuania, we went to the 9th fort at Kaunas, another place of massacre. And I just took some photographs of what people were doing in the area. This is a massive memorial at the site. People were walking their dogs. This girl was a model. She was sort of throwing her hair back and posing for photographs. These kids are riding this guy's riding his scooter over the mass grave. Kids playing. This person's jogging. These people are flying a drone. There's the drone. Oh yeah, there's this girl posing for photographs again. So, is this harmless? Should we worry about this? How worried should we be? Is this quite minor? Well, something I learnt about in Serbia, and this shocked me, at the mass grave of Jajinci, where 80,000 people were buried, there had been a girl recently who had put a photograph of herself on Instagram. She had broken up with her boyfriend and was feeling very victimized and very vulnerable, and she photographed herself in a bikini, lying on this mass grave, put it on social media to emphasize that she was a victim and she was traumatized after breaking up with her boyfriend. And so she was saying that just as this is a site of victimhood and trauma, it was therefore appropriate for her to display her trauma and victimhood by being photographed in a bikini there. To me, that is inappropriate behavior, because that is an individual misappropriating the narrative of a site, but it's even worse when governments do it. So, I mean, I'm actually interested to hear what you think, if I pause here to ask your opinion about what is appropriate, what is inappropriate at the site of a mass grave. What do you think?
I think it's insensitive, because I often see photos from the Berlin Holocaust Memorial, and a lot of girls and even boys just stand there on the wall in between the big blocks of concrete. And it's, I don't know, to me it's dumb. It's just, you do not take the history into account, and it's insensitive. It's just, I think you should know better and take the photo outside, you have to show yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think
people are 90% idiots, 10% beautiful.
we might have to change those statistics, but yes.
Basically, this is the case of the school trips. Every single one school trip, kids just photoshopping themselves here, and they think it's fun. But when you ask them about the place, they don't even know anything about it. So it's just a trend of today's society. Doesn't think about bad things.
Yeah.
Follow up in a bad way.
Yes. I mean, I think we all take selfies of ourselves all the time, don't we? I mean, I took a selfie of myself at this site.
That's a reason.
But it was
one more thing I wanted to say that if I was a boy, I would leave that girl too, because it was really crazy. She was really itself.
Yeah, well, yeah. Little disturbed. But I suppose you have to think about what's the reason for taking a selfie. Well, I suppose my reason for taking a selfie was just to a sort of, I was here, I came here as a researcher, but also I suppose a bit of a pilgrim, and telling people that this site exists in Lithuania. It is the place where thousands of Jews were massacred, and it was sort of, I suppose I was doing it in an educational way. So I suppose you can think about the motivation, but sort of showing off your hair and makeup is perhaps a different sort of motivation. Any other thoughts about what's appropriate? It's not an easy question. I don't expect you to have the answer, but more I think it's important that we simply think through all of these issues, and to decide for ourselves that within our culture, within our town, what is appropriate. Is it right that we put up signs saying, this is a place of massacre, please behave with dignity? You know, do we need those signs? Well, let's think about wear and tear caused by visitors. And I took these photos before the pandemic at Auschwitz-Birkenau. And as you can see, loads and loads and loads of tourists. And one of the problems with tourists is that they sort of, nobody's looking, I'm going to take a piece of barbed wire. And another problem is simply all of these footsteps are going to wear down the site. Let's think about encroachment of buildings too close to a site. Now, these photographs were taken at Decay, and I'm informed that these houses, which look straight into the site, once belonged to guards and now belong to the families of guards, of former guards. And so it belongs to people who have inherited these houses. What more can you say? I mean, it's one thing to have a house that was built at the time of the camp, and I suppose it's another thing to start building these houses right next to a camp today. Now, the first question is, why would you want to have a house that looks into a former concentration camp? And I suppose the second thing is, when there is a Holocaust site, should there be some kind of a buffer zone or a barrier around it where no building should be allowed, a sort of respectful distance around a camp? Again, all of these have no right answer, but they're just things for us to think about. Let's think about lack of heritage protection. It's something I think that Pavel and I have reflected on yesterday. Pavel took me out around the landscape around Pilsen, and we visited various sorts of camps. And time and again, I learned that so many of them are not protected and so could be destroyed. This is a particularly worrying example from Belarus. This is an army soldier who was pulling bones out of the mass grave. And so when you have a mass grave, there are two things about exhuming mass graves. First of all, if a mass grave contains bodies of Jews, and this was a Jewish massacre, according to Jewish law, or halakha, you cannot disturb the dead, no matter how they were killed. Whether you're talking about a mass grave or whether you're talking about a cemetery, you cannot disturb the dead. And in some countries, the rabbis are more flexible and will allow you to exhume a mass grave, but in other countries it's forbidden. So, for example, the chief rabbi in the United Kingdom will not allow any kind of exhumation of the Jewish dead. But in Belarus, I don't know if anybody consulted the rabbi, So not only should these dead not have been disturbed, but also when you excavate a cemetery or a mass grave, as an archaeologist, you know the importance of of understanding that you're working with a crime scene, and as part of your respect for the dead, you must excavate, if you can, one skeleton at a time, keeping all of the bones of that person together, recording them, seeing if there's any traces of a crime in the way of bullets. Are there any personal possessions? Are there buttons? Are there shoe buckles? Are there personal possessions on the body which might help in identifying the person? And what you do not do is simply pull bones out of the ground and mix them all together in a box. This is very bad. But this was really recent. And I think perhaps there probably isn't much. I mean, I haven't been to Belarus, but I'm guessing there isn't much respect towards the Holocaust dead there, but I might be wrong. Maybe there are archaeologists like us there. I don't know, Pavel, do you?
Dealing just with prehistoric and medieval culture, not post-medieval contemporary at all.
Yeah. And what is going to happen to this box of bones? I don't know. Is it going to be reburied or thrown in the river? Who knows? Well, let's talk about destruction of sites due to new building projects. Let's return to the site of Compiègne Royalieu Transit Camp. So this is the camp that I said where, similarly to the camp of Drancy, which you've probably heard of, French Jews were gathered here before being sent to concentration camps. This was a former military camp dating from just before World War I, and it was used by the military in World War I and after the war. But at the time of the Second World War, this wing was used for housing political prisoners, members of the resistance, before being sent to concentration camps. This wing was used for housing French Jews, and this wing was used for housing Americans. And these are simply civilians, American civilians, who happen to be either traveling in Europe, perhaps as a traveling jazz band, for example, or living in France, or on holiday in France, who knows, but simply Americans who were caught in occupied France at the time the Germans arrived. They were not deported to Auschwitz, but they were kept as civilian internees here. Now, as it happens, there were also a few hundred people from the Channel Islands who were here, including my father's cousin and uncle and aunt, who were kept here, and they were sent on to civilian internment camps elsewhere in Germany. But this is a photo taken from Google Earth in 2001, and this is Google Earth in 2010, and these three blocks here are these three blocks here. And it seems crazy to me that a Holocaust site in France should have been destroyed so recently. I'm really surprised that this was allowed, but these three blocks were kept as part of the museum at a site, and that museum was opened in 2008, and I went for the opening. And in 2008, it was a really excellent exhibition, full of cutting-edge technology. They had one of those digital tables. Have you ever seen a digital table at a museum? It's one of those things where it's like a giant computer screen, and you put your hand above it, and you can move digital documents, and you can sort of enlarge them and shrink them like you can on your phone. And if you move between the table and a laser beam, you can trigger a voice reading out some of the documents. So it was all very clever. And I went again a couple of years ago to the museum, and everything had broken, and it was not looking very good. So anyway, but I'm just really surprised that this was allowed. But it happens, it's still happening. Now, I mentioned earlier about the importance of a management plan to bring everything together. And simply, I was with my group in Auschwitz-Birkenau last year for a workshop, and we were shown around the SS canteen, which still survives, and a sub-camp nearby of Jawisowicz. And these buildings are not part of Auschwitz-Birkenau. So what you'll often find with these concentration camps is that there will be, if you like, a concept that this is the camp. And yet originally there would have been more buildings that were part of the camp, but they were not included as part of the memorial site for various reasons. Perhaps the other buildings had been reused for something else or weren't considered important or relevant to be part of the site. And this is the case at Auschwitz. So really, what happens to places like this? And the answer is, in Auschwitz-Birkenau, there are private members of the public who take it upon themselves to look after these sites. And the person that we were introduced to, who was looking after these sites, had absolutely no training at all, didn't have a university degree, didn't really know what he was doing, but he had decided to restore these sites. And so there's a problem there with untrained people doing this work, but also if you have a management plan which considers all of the former buildings of a camp, you can really keep an eye on them all and make sure they're all being adequately safeguarded. I also want to say a word about linked sites. When we were in Kaunas in Lithuania, we were taken to many different sites in the town. We were taken to the place where Jews were deported to the forts in order to be killed. We were shown the prison where some of the Jews were housed. We were shown the Gestapo headquarters. We were shown part of the former ghetto. That was the police headquarters in the former ghetto. This was a place where several Jews were killed before the massive rounding up of thousands of people. But none of these sites are linked. We visited them all in the wrong order. And we were just so confused about where each of these sites fitted into the story. And it would be very useful for there to be proper heritage interpretation where you visit sites in the right order. First you go to the ghetto, and then you go here, and then you go there, and then it will all fit together nicely. And so there can be a problem that, let us say, if only one of the sites becomes protected, or only one of the sites has any kind of heritage interpretation, that means that there's a danger that some of the other sites could be demolished, and you would lose part of the story. So it's all about making sure everything fits together. Also, there are problems with memorial visions. Now, I was on holiday in Slovenia last year, and we went to Trieste, just over the border into Italy. And of course, whenever I'm on holiday, I always have to visit concentration camps. I know Pavel will agree with me. This is what you have to do on holiday. I went to the Risiera di San Saba, which is the Holocaust site or the concentration camp in Trieste. And we visited this building here, which is called the Hall of Crosses. And I found this information in the display for tourists. And this is a quote from an architect called Romano Boico, who had turned the camp into a memorial in the 1960s. And he said, "I planned to remove and fence off rather than to add, having eliminated the ruined buildings." What? "I cordoned off the area with 11-metre-high concrete walls. The cordoned-off courtyard intentionally becomes an open-air cathedral. The prisoners' building is completely emptied, the wooden frame stripped away, as bare as was necessary." So what he had done is he had removed a lot of the original fabric of the camp, which, for people like me and Pavel, it strikes terror into our hearts that they had removed the original fabric in order to create a memorial. Now, what they had done in this building, this was a building of multiple floors. But the architect had taken away the floors so that it became just one large building. And by calling it a Hall of Crosses, well, that fits very nicely into the Italian Roman Catholic identity, doesn't it? And so it sort of became a place of Roman Catholic martyrdom. This is intentional, these Christian symbolism. There were pictures of the Virgin Mary everywhere. It was very Roman Catholic, and yet this is a place where Jews were held. And this is an example of misappropriation, because it's not telling a realistic story. But the memorial vision has taken away original fabric from this site in order to create a different story. So what are the key issues that we've got here? And this is moving on to the, I do have an eye on the time, Pavel, this is moving on to the second part of what I wanted to talk to you about. Now, if we're idealists, which we aspire to be, we believe that Holocaust sites should have a function only of remembrance, education, and memorialization. Because we believe it's not okay to have a pig farm on a Roma concentration camp. Instead, these places should be places where you go and learn and remember. But we must be realists. And as realists, we recognize that it's nearly 80 years since the end of World War II, and we are not making decisions today based on having ownership or control of all sites since 1945. These sites are not like Pompeii. We are not discovering them for the first time, perfectly preserved as they were in 1945. Not at all. So we've got a problem. And that is there a pragmatic solution to help safeguard sites today? Should we be realists? Should we give up on being idealists? So let's illustrate that with some case studies. So if we want to protect sites, if we want to look after them, the problem is it's just not practical or even possible at some sites, and it's been impossible for decades. And after all, when Pavel was showing me yesterday the site of a concentration camp and other places I've seen, they're archaeological sites today, and we can't turn them back into concentration camps. We have to admit it's not practical. This is a photograph of the Dresden Barracks in Terezin, which I'm sure, as many of you are aware, has been greatly damaged by a number of storms and floods in the last couple of years. And this is what it looks like inside. And it's increasingly too late for us to hold these sites to the highest standards of safeguarding. So we have to be pragmatic, we have to be practical. This is another photograph of where the roof has collapsed inside a building at the Dresden Barracks in Terezin. So the Dresden Barracks are not part of Terezin Memorial, but they are part of the former ghetto. And talking to the director of the site, he says, well, while they could restore the Dresden Barracks and include it as part of the memorial, actually they don't need the space, and they don't have enough members of staff to put into a new building. But they acknowledge, of course, that this building is important because it was an iconic part, or it was part of an iconic film, I should say, a propaganda film made by the Nazis about Terezin. And I know you'll all be familiar with that film as you are Czech citizens. And we know it would cost millions or billions of euros to repair Terezin. But at the same time, the war in Ukraine has caused a cost of living crisis. In the UK at the moment, the cost of petrol and electricity and gas has gone up massively. I now spend, the cost of heating my house is now 5 times what it was last year. So I'm sure you've had a similar problem in the Czech Republic. And local people have a problem, perhaps, with us spending money on the dead when the living need it more. So can we be pragmatic here? Can we say, okay, look, let's restore the Dresden Barracks, but it can be turned into homes. It can be turned into shops. And that's okay because there is a memorial outside the building saying what it was once used for. Is that okay? Can we arrive at this position and say, look, we understand this is a big problem. We can't afford the perfect solution. It's not practical. It's just too late for that. Are we going to be okay if we've got a memorial? Have we done our job? If we restore the site and allow it to be used for almost anything, not a pig farm, but maybe, not a sausage museum, but maybe it could be turned into domestic housing. Let's take the example, let's go back to Belgrade in Serbia and talk about Staro Simic. Staro Simic is a collection of buildings that was once, it was built in 1938 as an international pavilion. And the idea was that different countries could come and show their latest technical developments. They could show off their cars, they could show off their, the objects that they make in their countries. And that's what these buildings were used for originally. They were international pavilions. But although it was built in 1938, when the Germans arrived, they turned it into a concentration camp. And it had the name of the Judenlager, or Jewish lager, Semlin. So Semlin is the name of the place in Belgrade where it is. And it was used for that between December 1941 and May 1942. Now today, all of these buildings still survive, but they're used for other things. The area is very run down. It's clearly a low-income area. Some people live here, including, there used to be some Roma living here. There used to be refugees. One of the buildings is a restaurant today. There are some homeless people who squat here. But those who live here are actually, in a way, keeping the building standing. We might not like the idea of having a restaurant in a concentration camp, but at least they're preserving the building by heating it and using it. Now, the Serbian government, the plan at the moment, is to get rid of all of the people who live there and to knock down all of the other little buildings that have grown up in this area since the war. There's a lot of very low quality, falling apart houses in the area. And the idea is to demolish all of those, get rid of all of the people, restore all of the buildings and turn it into a memorial. And you might think, okay, well, that's doing the right thing. They're turning it into a site of memory. They're respecting it. It's been run down for many years. At last, they're going to recognize it. But at the same time, we can sort of think, hold on, is this ethical? Is it ethical to kick out the living to respect the dead, especially when we're dealing with refugees, Roma people, etc.? So is that necessarily the best thing to do? Well, I thought about this and I thought, okay, we need to have a little diagram here to help us think through this. And so I thought about having what I call the 3D model of heritage pragmatics. This is trying to make it sound very scientific. And so the first question we ask ourselves along the x-axis, this is the question of, could we restore? Can we restore? Is it possible? Is it possible to preserve the site? So let's think, with Terezin, could we restore it? Yes, we could. It would be expensive. We can do it. At Stylo Simic, could we restore all of those buildings? Yes, we can. Yeah, it's expensive. We can do it. The y-axis is, should we preserve or restore? Is that the right thing to do? Is it ethical? Is it wise? At Terezin, should we restore it? Well, let's think. The local people need money too. Maybe we can justify turning it into accommodation or a shop, and maybe, we've got, it becomes rather a difficult ethical question. If we think again at Stylo Simic in Belgrade, should we restore it? Should we preserve it? Should we kick out all the local people? Should we knock down the houses that have been built since the war? This isn't very good, is it? And then the x-axis, how big is this problem? Are we, what is the size of the problem? Can we work around it? Can we think of other solutions? Well, can we think of a pragmatic response? And indeed, I think at Terezin and at Stylo Simic we can. These are big problems, but I think we can think around them. We can think of other solutions. But it's very important that when we think about all of these things, we have to ask every stakeholder. This can't be about me and Pavel sitting in our universities and making decisions for everybody. It's important that you ask everybody. So for those who aren't familiar with the word stakeholder in English, it's everyone who has an interest in the subject. So you would ask members of the Jewish community, you would ask the Roma community, you would ask the politicians, you would ask the local people who live nearby, you would ask the activists, the people who have been campaigning for years about the site. You ask everybody who's interested. So let's consult people, let's together find a solution and apply it to Terezin and Stylo Simic. So if we're going to be pragmatic about this, as I think we should, we have to think about alternative uses and whether they're acceptable as long as there are accurate memorials and information boards and signage. And I think also this is where digital heritage comes in. So this is where I get out my phone and I think about apps. And at Gusen, for example, that village where it was built on top of a concentration camp, one of the things they don't like is tourists looking over their hedges and saying, "Why are you living in a concentration camp? That's awful, you're a bad person." Instead, if you've got an app, well, the great thing about an app is you can go up to a building and you can go, "That's how it looked like before the war, that's how it looks like today. Now I can read the historical information." Where's the next slide? And so I'm not hassling members of the public. So I like apps. Apps can be useful solutions where it can be too expensive, because apps don't cost billions of euros. You don't have to spend that in order to find a solution for your site. And can we also engage local communities, get them involved, hear what the local communities think about how to look after their heritage, and see what they think about pragmatic solutions? Because after all, if Pavel and I come to sites and our colleagues elsewhere in Europe and we put up information plaques and signs without asking people, we go there the following week and these have been removed. So you need local communities to agree and to be on your side and to have a dialogue where you can all agree together. So let's lose our naivety about this. I think we have to understand that no site looks as it did in 1945. There have been 80 years of changes, 80 years of post-war reuses. And many of these sites have been cleaned up, sanitized, restored, interpreted, and landscaped. So even the best sites, if you like, the best looked after, have changed. And some have been destroyed entirely. And many of them have gone through many different changes, depending on the director and the person who's had a memorial vision. For example, at the Risiera di San Saba in Trieste. So it is too late and naive for us to see Holocaust sites as sacred and untouchable. They're not anymore. We can't think that way anymore. We have to be pragmatic with our future solutions. And that is all I wanted to say to you today. So I hope you've enjoyed that.
Thank you very much indeed, and I think there'll be some questions. These are very challenging topics, I would say.
I'm happy to take any questions on anything. I'm not offended by anything, so please ask those questions that you always want to ask and you're too shy to ask.
So just only one comment regarding the graves, mass graves. That's exactly the program we're having in Decay, because it was not sure where the mass graves were situated or located, and the memorial which was opened by former President Václav Havel in 1995 was built on the place. It was believed it was the camp cemetery, but it was, we are not sure. So the reality is that now we know, because we did some archaeological excavations and then survey, we know that the graves are situated just 2 meters far from the memorial. It's in an open space. There's a lawn, and that some of the graves are very shallow. Nevertheless, the people who walk there, they simply step on these graves, and there was no respect to this. So the first solution the Museum of Roma Culture did was to fence the area we indicated as archaeologists to prevent people walking over these graves, and now they've been thinking about some, sort of they want to put some layer, to change change the area. So this is really important, and it's all about knowledge.
Yeah.
And regarding perception of the place, we have very interesting and also disturbing evidence. I mean, the contemporary perception of the place, material evidence. Because when we excavated the memorial, we found artifacts that indicate what people do there, and it was very, very, very disturbing. Very, very disturbing.
If you perhaps are thinking about a site that you've seen and you're thinking, it doesn't seem to fit what Gilly said, it doesn't, maybe she hasn't thought about these kinds of threats or problems, please tell me, because, I'm very open to ideas, thoughts, reflections, observations.
I have a small little comment or also a question as well. I was working with Volksbund Czech Gravel for a couple of months, digging the German soldiers, and the question is, because every single time when I open the internet and I watch, for example, pages Pomost or also Volksbund Czech Gravel, and there are ethical questions about photographing these bodies. And my question was if it's okay to make a photograph, because for us archaeologists it's a necessary documentation, for example, but for the public, it's kind of disturbing to let that photos outcome to the web or to public. And my question was if it's okay to make a photo shooting or not.
Yeah, I mean, Pavel and I were talking about this in the car yesterday, because there's, different countries in Europe have different ideas about this. Now, in the UK, certainly as part of your documentation, you need to photograph things, but there's a question about what you publish, to whom, and also in the UK at the moment, we're thinking a lot about what you put on display in museums. And there's been a lot of removal of skeletal material from museums because that's seen as unethical to present the dead to the public. Especially part of the issue with that in the UK is to do with colonialism, where we've put on display bodies of Maori and Aboriginal people and and Native Americans, etc., etc. But in terms of photographing these things, I was saying to Pavel, I've read archaeological reports reporting on the excavation of bodies found in the trenches in World War I sites, and the photographs are not shown. So Pavel and I were also talking about what's appropriate to show to children, and certainly I said in the UK we do not show in school textbooks any pictures of the dead, whether we talked about executions, hangings, dead bodies, exhumed bodies. You do not show those in textbooks in schools in the UK. But I understand in the Czech Republic you do, and that's considered absolutely fine.
Well, we don't, basically.
Not in textbooks, but there's no restriction regarding presentation of dead bodies like the Second World War victims. I consulted with colleagues from the Faculty of Education, so it's up to the teacher.
I was only interested because I'll go to Poland and other countries, because when I watch Poland's work, it's like they are presenting every single one aspect.
Yes, the Poles show.
And for us, it's or for me mostly, and other scholars, it's unethical.
Yeah.
And I was asking if there's model.
Well, I mean, there are various international agreements or charters put out by various countries about what's ethical, and they mostly were written thinking about the ill treatment of indigenous people by Europeans. But I think, for me, you have to think about, are you re-victimizing the dead? We don't have the consent of the dead to show them as victims of massacres. It can be traumatizing for the descendants to see pictures knowing that their grandfather, their father, is there. at the same time, the work that archaeologists do in sort of saying, look, we found a skeleton and we found the watch that you said your grandpa was wearing when he was massacred, and here's your grandpa's watch back. That can be, I've mashed the, the microphone. That can be so powerful. It can be, I mean, you know, as archaeologists, we can do amazing things for families who have lost their loved ones. And even giving the watch of the grandpa can be a little bit like returning the grandpa to the family who's lost it. But your question is about photographing things. Yeah, I think certainly you have to think about what you photograph and to whom you're showing it and what sort of publication, and there might be a difference between your academic publication in a journal article, yeah, scientific versus a sort of popular in a magazine where you're trying to get your work better known, what you put online, etc. And I think that if you do show skeletal material in popular material, you have to have a good reason for doing so, and you might sort of need the consent of the family and all of these sorts of things. But, you know, that's part of the whole conversation, I think, so yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Awesome. Some questions for you?
Okay, let me ask you then, what do you think about having a pragmatic approach versus an idealist approach? So let me go back to this question. Do you think we should be idealists or should we be realists? Should we say, Gilly, you're wrong, we shouldn't be pragmatic, we must always, 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 no matter what it costs, pay our millions of euros to restore buildings, to turn them into memorials, doesn't matter if you're kicking out living people. This is, you know, we're human beings, we're civilized, we respect victims of the Holocaust. This is what we should aim for. I don't care for this realist position. That's nonsense. Do you have any thoughts on that? I don't mind. I mean, you know, universities are safe spaces for talking through ideas. It's not about agreeing with the person who's speaking at the front of the room.
Certainly, it's a general question regarding heritage for not only about Holocaust sites.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
It's kind of pragmatism in heritage management.
Yeah.
Maybe some compromises between the two poles.
Can you think of some examples, or do you have any particular sites in mind?
Well, basically, yes. I'm still thinking about one site we recently started excavating, and it's because of the leadership of that site allowed us to do so. Because 20th archaeology in our country is not something people are used to see quite often, and here basically on that cooperation with the leadership, we were allowed to do so, and without that cooperation, or basically if the leadership would say no, we don't want to allow you to do something like that, we are out and we cannot do anything, and basically the companies would came and establish here some big industrial park without any archaeological documentation. So yeah, that's why I thought something like something between that, something between idealistic position and realistic.
Yeah, but the realist position is already a compromise. Anything is a compromise on that. But also I think that as archaeologists, we are stakeholders, because when you've excavated a site, you feel a sense of ownership, whether or not you should, but it becomes, this is my site. I've spent a long time digging here. I feel like I'm speaking for the dead or want to, and you become an activist. And I think it's important to be an activist. It's important to, I don't know, I consider myself an activist, and I've been doing all sorts of things as an activist for, for 15, 20 years, but the sort of activism I do is on behalf of the dead. It's about fighting to get memorials, it's about putting together museum exhibitions, it's about writing articles in the local newspaper, making TV documentaries, being interviewed on the radio, making speeches, speaking on Holocaust Memorial Day, just sort of doing lots of things to make sure you're raising awareness and that people don't forget. So I think the sort of activists that we do as academics is slightly different to the activism of people who go on marches holding banners. But it's still, you know, our work is still important.
And the question we're facing all the time, are you an activist or are you a scientist?
Yes.
Well, I think we can be both.
Yeah, of course. Absolutely. Absolutely. And when I first began doing this work, somebody said to me, academics should not be activists. And
Should not be involved and so on.
I sort of fundamentally disagreed with that, and I didn't really understand why we shouldn't or how we could avoid being activists. Because after all, we're doing this work because we care about it, and we care about the dead, and we care about the victims, and we're passionate about it. We're passionate about the history.
As activist approach can move these things more forward when we speak
Yeah.
about the public.
Yes, exactly. And when our work, again, informed by conversations I've had with Pavel this week, that when our work proves the truth of the past, that in itself is an act of activism. And, we do it our own way, but we do it because we couldn't stop ourselves,
Yeah, certainly it's difficult to become a Bronze Age activist.
Yeah, exactly, yes.
But, contemporary archaeology is a very different story.
It is. And I think the more I do this work, the more I realise how important archaeology is as part of this, because all of the photographs I've shown you are mostly of sites that are still standing, but the vast majority are simply ruins or beneath the surface of the soil. So, it is our work as archaeologists, and I think as conflict archaeologists or as archaeologists of dark modernity, it is our task to do this. If we're saying what is the task of this generation, this is our work. It's my work anyway, and I know it's Pavel's work, and I know we both feel very passionately about this. So I hope you do too, and I hope you all decide that this is work that you want to do, and that there are damn good reasons why we should all do it.
Right, so thank you very much again for a great talk, and we can continue our discussion in the evening in Drupa. In Drupa Bar, if you're interested. So we can be here at 6 or so, and we present Gilly academic life in the University of So thank you very much for coming, and next week we're going to have a number of lectures actually, because we have a colleague from Hungary who will present Hungarian approaches to area archaeology, and then we have a group of colleagues coming from Kyrgyzstan. So please come next week. Yeah. Thank you very much.